Today we're going to start a series of lectures that are a little bit different from what we've had before. We're going to have history today and archaeology in the three lectures right after San Juan del Sur and Punta Arenas. Title of this lecture is Pizarro and the Conquest of the Incas. And I'm going to start all the next lecture today and the next three with this particular slide, although it's going to change a little bit because the box up there at the upper left or upper right with the word Inca will not be one highlighted in the next couple lectures. In the next few, it's going to be, the next lecture, it's going to be down here. Moche will be the highlighted one, and then we'll come back and look at the Incas for Machu Picchu, and then the last of that sequence, just before we get to Lima, we're going to be talking about the Nazca culture. So that one will be the one that's highlighted. And I might also start out by pointing out something a couple people have asked me questions about. Don't I know how to spell? And spell the word Inca. Among archaeologists, particularly starting with the Peruvian archaeologists about 15 years ago, and by agreement about 10 years ago with North American and European archaeologists, the preference these days is to spell Inca with the K rather than the C. That comes closest, at least in the minds of the indigenous people, of pronouncing it like they pronounce it in the Quechua language. So the standard spelling of the word today is Inca. That's the politically correct way of spelling it. And we'll start out with a little bit of the history of the Incas, the last Inca kings. The first of the really great Inca kings was a guy named Pachacútec, who ruled from sometime relatively early in the 1400s to about 1471. We don't know the exact dates for him. He's a couple generations before the arrival of the Spanish and records getting written down and so forth. But Pachacútec is usually referred to as the Alexander the Great of the Incas. He's the guy that really expanded the empire out of the Cusco area and began conquering neighboring tribes and expanding the empire. One of his sons was a guy named Topa Inca, or Inca Yupanqui. He ruled upon the death of Pachacútec to about 1493. The date there, 1493, is a little bit more exact. It's 40 years before the Spanish conquest, and so people were alive when the Spanish were writing down records and getting the history of the Incas, and were able to give a pretty good date for him. He was a general for Pachacútec before he became the top ruler, and one of the things that had happened is a group of people the Incas had conquered had rebelled and got into a big fight. They lost, and Topa Inca Yupanqui was the general that chased after them, and he kept chasing after them and kept chasing after them and ended up conquering a very large area in northern, what is today northern Peru, by virtue of the chase after these people who had rebelled. He also conquered what is today down to central Chile and a little bit of what is today Ecuador. His son Huayna Capac conquered the rest of Ecuador, expanded the empire to its greatest extent. One thing I might point out when I say his son, each of these guys, Pachacútec, Topa Inca Yupanqui, Huayna Capac, probably the earlier Inca kings, all had a principal wife, that was their sister, and had concubines and consorts, probably had children by dozens, if not hundreds, of women. So when you talk about sons, there were lots and lots and lots of sons. And it was not necessarily the oldest son of the principal wife who became the next king. It was a decision that was made by the family group, and obviously this would have been a very large family, that the most competent guy got to be the next king. Also, the Incas had a system of split inheritance. The new king basically got the power, but nothing else. The old king's relatives, children, wives, and so forth, continued to live in his palace, continued to collect taxes in his name and honor his name and honor him. because he was still living, or at least existing, in his old palace. He was a mummy, and he could go out and visit his son, the new king, and his grandson, the next new king, and so forth. At the time of the Spanish arrival in Cusco, there were supposedly at least 6 and perhaps 9 mummies that were there, previous Inca kings that were there to visit and watch the Spanish arrive. Okay, Huayna Capac was ruling until 1527. By 1527, the Spanish were already touching around South America. In fact, Spaniards had probably already come up the east side of South America, the Rio de la Plata, Paraná river system, and had reached what is today Paraguay. A Spaniard probably had explored in western Paraguay and touched on the Inca Empire somewhere around 1524 or 1525. And with him, he brought European diseases. So that somewhere around 1525, 1526, 1527, the Inca Empire experienced a major epidemic. We don't know exactly what it was, but it was probably smallpox or measles, and Huayna Capac died in that epidemic. Unfortunately, the designated heir, the guy that was supposed to be the next king, also died in that epidemic, which left a real problem because there now wasn't a designated heir. And Huayna Capac had expanded all the way to what is today northern Ecuador and had set up a second capital. Cusco was the main capital, but Huayna Capac had set up a second capital. He apparently had some very attractive wives up in Ecuador, and he spent a lot of time up there, and he favored one of the sons that was from Ecuador. And so now we have the Cusco capital and we have the Quito capital with families in both and some problems. When Huayna Capac died, one of his sons, Huáscar, became the new king in Cusco, and one of his sons from Quito, Atahualpa, became the ruler in the north. So for a period of about 5 years, we have the two pretenders to the throne fighting. And there was civil war. In 1532, Atahualpa defeated the army of Huáscar, and Huáscar was killed by Atahualpa's men. So that ended the civil war. Huáscar's family, basically all of his relatives in Cusco, were supposedly killed. This is the normal way of doing things. You get rid of the pretending other leader and all of his family to eliminate any possible dissent. So that takes us up to 1532. Now we're going to switch gears, and we're going to go to Spain. And we're going to go to Extremadura, an area in southwestern Spain, and looks something like this or like that. You might notice the animals. Pigs. Lots of pigs. They're grazing on acorns that have fallen off the oak trees, which are typical in the landscape of Extremadura. And why do I show you a pig? Because the hero or the villain of our story starts out as a pig herder. A guy by the name of Francisco Pizarro, and he is the illegitimate son of a minor hidalgo or minor royal official in the town of Trujillo in Extremadura. Again, I need to back up a little bit, all the way back to 712 AD, when the people of North Africa, Berber people or the Moors of North Africa, invaded Spain and made it into a Muslim area. The Muslim armies expanded from Spain, what is today Spain and Portugal, into France. In 732, there was a big battle southwest of Paris. The Frankish forces, or what we would call the French forces, the non-Muslim forces, Christian forces, led by a guy by the name of Charles Martel, defeated the Muslim army, 732. It's exactly 100 years after the death of Muhammad, so it was a significant date for the Islamic peoples, and began to push the Muslim forces back. That push of driving the Muslim forces out of southwestern Europe went on for hundreds of years. In Spain, in Spanish, this is referred to as the Reconquista. And if you think about it, it goes on for more than 700 years, from 732 all the way up to 1492. That's longer than what the United States has existed. It's longer than any of the real modern states of Western Europe have existed. And it wasn't 700 some years of fighting. It was occasional battles and then decades or even a century or so of peace, and then there would be more fighting and the front lines would push farther to the south or to the west, and then there would be maybe the Islamic forces would reconquer a bit, and then there'd be pushes back and so forth. It was a long, long period of time in which there was fighting going on in what is today Spain and Portugal, leading up obviously to 1492. The point of telling that part of the story is that for a young man in what is today Spain, at any point in that time, if you were born of low status, you could increase your status, gain some wealth, some fame, by fighting in the Reconquista. It was a way of people moving up in society during those periods of warfare. So let's go to Trujillo. It's in Extremadura, southwestern Spain. And it's a relatively small town still today. It used to have a wall all the way around it. During that period of the Reconquista, towns that were at the frontier were walled, protecting them from invading armies from the other side. In fact, if you go to Spain today, many of the small towns will have the name de la Frontera as part of their name, and that simply indicates that at some point or other during the Reconquista period, they were a frontier town. But this is a small town. That's the church, and in front of the church there's a statue. And the statue is of the most famous person born in that town ever, Francisco Pizarro. Again, his father was a minor hidalgo, a minor official, and had some status. Unfortunately for Pizarro, he was illegitimate, and his father did have some legitimate sons. There again, the statue. There is an identical statue in Lima. And that's the statue in Lima, exactly the same statue, made from the same mold. It used to be right on the Plaza de Armas in downtown Lima, right next to the government palace, on a little side plaza right next to the government palace. In fact, the main entry for most people going into the government palace, sort of the side door, but the normal entry door, when you came out that door, this is the first thing you saw. A few years ago, the president of Peru was a man by the name of Toledo. He was the first indigenous president of Peru, and the very first thing that he did as president was order the statue commemorating Pizarro to be removed from the plaza in downtown Lima. It's now in a small park outside of the downtown area. This is the Pizarro household in Trujillo, back in Spain. It is the fanciest house in Trujillo. It's not the home that Pizarro grew up in. It's not even his father's house. It's his brother's house that comes into the story later on. And here's a close-up view on the house. It's a very, very fancy house right in Trujillo. Okay, Pizarro was born somewhere around 1476. We don't know an exact date. Again, being illegitimate, it wasn't something that got recorded very well. And he died in 1541. If you have good math skills, you might notice he dies at an age of about 65. That's pretty old in those days. He lived to be an old man. And here's another view of him, a painting of him. He arrived in the New World in around 1500. I'm going to show you a lot of drawings like this in this lecture and in a couple of the ones to come. This is a woodcut drawing done by a man by the name of Felipe Huaman Poma de Ayala. He was the son, or perhaps the grandson, of a high Inca princess, probably a daughter of Huayna Capic or a granddaughter of Topa Inca Yupanqui, and a Spaniard. So he was a mestizo. He was a mixed blood man. But somewhere around the year 1600, 2 generations after the conquest, he was upset with the treatment of the Indians, and he wrote a letter to the Spanish crown complaining about the treatment of the Indians. And he illustrated his letter with a series of woodcut drawings. Again, I'm going to be using some of those in my lectures coming up after Punta Arenas. It wasn't a letter like we would normally write. It ran to 1,000 pages or more. And it did not reach the Spanish king, but around 1900, a little bit later, 1910 or so, it was found in an archive in Denmark. How it got to Denmark, nobody knows, but it's a fantastic book. A 1,000-page letter makes into a nice book. It's usually published in 3 volumes, and it includes a lot of these drawings that we'll see. This is a mestizo, an Indian view of what a Spanish ship might have looked like. And in terms of the conquest, we start with Ferdinand and Isabella. They got married in 1469 and created a unified Spanish government. Their armies defeated the last of the Islamic forces, the Moors in Granada, in early 1492. That reconquest was over. Among other things, when they did that, one of the orders that they sent out was for everybody in Spain after 1492, January 1492, had to be Catholic. You either had to get out or you had to convert. And this had been a problem for years with the reconquest as they took over, as the Catholic forces took over areas from the Muslims. What do they do with the remaining Muslim population? And they forced many of them to convert. In Spanish, they called them conversos. And many of the conversos did not really convert, continued to practice their non-Catholic religion. That was a problem for the Catholic Church, and they created an institution called the Inquisition to deal with those converted people that maybe didn't really convert. They also kicked out anybody who didn't agree to convert, and so Islamic peoples had to go back to North Africa from Granada, and also Jews had to leave. During the entire reconquest period, Jews in Spain were the bankers, the financiers, the government ministers in charge of collecting taxes and so forth, and they were very efficient. They led the reconquest. It's interesting to note what would have happened if they had not kicked out those people that were financially pretty good. Would we all be hablando castellano en los Estados Unidos hoy día? Because the Spanish would have been much more efficient at running the New World if they hadn't kicked out those people. But the story goes on. Okay, we're cut off up there. I have to say one thing. I did notice yesterday with the slides and the size of the font, with people way in the back, yesterday afternoon, I took the time to redo my whole PowerPoint here and make all the font bigger so you people in the back can see. Unfortunately, I think I need to make sure that they're not quite on the edge. But I think we all know the date, 1492, Columbus meets with Ferdinand and Isabella, gets permission to sail, and goes off and, quote-unquote, discovers the New World. The New World was already there. People knew about it. They lived there, the native populations and so forth. But what Columbus did was he was the first guy that went back to Europe and said, I found something. It's possible somebody got there before him. We know that the Vikings were in the New World prior to Columbus in around 1000 AD, but Columbus is the first guy that goes back to Spain and tells everybody, I found something. Pizarro gets to the New World, to Santo Domingo, what is today the Dominican Republic, around 1500. Columbus had his first voyage in 1492. He immediately went back and had a second voyage because he had left some soldiers, some people behind. Unfortunately, they all died, and his first settlement was not successful. But on the second voyage, he took a lot more ships, a lot more people, settlers, and so forth. And the town that they set up, what is today Santo Domingo, was successful. Pizarro shows up on the records in that town around 1500. So this is very, very, very early in the settlement process. He next shows up about 1509 in the explorations along the coast of what is today Venezuela and Colombia, and the establishment of the town of Cartagena, Colombia. He's part of that group. In 1513, he's with Vasco Núñez de Balboa when they cross the Isthmus of Panama and discover the Pacific Ocean. He's not the top assistant to Balboa, but he is one of the people that is named in that expedition, so he's gained some status. He's an old-timer. He's been in the New World 13 years, and there aren't very many other people who have been around that long. A couple of years later, he was second in command of the exploration of western Panama and probably even into what is today Costa Rica, the eastern part of Costa Rica. And out of that expedition, he gains not just some status, but some wealth. They found a little bit of gold in western Panama, and this is a successful expedition in terms of how things were going. So he's now somebody of some real status in what is today Panama City. He fell in with a couple of other people, and I keep putting here in blue whenever we're introducing a new character to our story. A man by the name of Diego de Almagro became his partner, along with a Catholic priest in Panama. And they kept hearing that there was more gold to the south than there was to the west. From Panama, if you go west, you're into Central America. If you go south, you're into what is today Colombia. And the people of Colombia had gold, worked gold, and they were hearing that there was gold in Colombia. So that was where they set up a little expedition. They got a couple of boats and sailed along the coast of Colombia. They didn't find much. There are some stories that said they found a little bit of gold, enough to be intriguing, but they kept hearing stories when they would talk to the people that there was more gold to the south. Keep going and you'll find more gold. Don't stay with us. Get out of here. Move on. Get to the next spot. So a couple of years later, Pizarro leads a second expedition along the coast of Colombia and into the coast of Ecuador. We're not sure exactly where they ended up, but they did find enough gold to pay for the expedition. And Almagro went back to Panama to get reinforcements. Pizarro and some of his men stayed on an island off the coast of Ecuador for a period of time. And this is Pizarro on the right. I think Pizarro is this guy here. And on the left is Almagro, again, a woodcut from Felipe Juan Poma de Ayala. So they're on an island. They're there for a period of time, virtually stranded. The local people were feeding them, so they're not starving, but the conditions weren't real good. And after a while, a ship came, and it was sent out by Almagro to rescue them, and the ship was ordered to take them back to Panama. Pizarro didn't want anything to do with that. He wanted to go on to where there was supposed to be gold farther to the south. They kept hearing these stories. And Pizarro drew a line in the sand. There's supposed to be this very dramatic thing. He draws a line in the sand with his sword, says, "Who's with me and who's going back to Panama?" 13 guys cross over the line, stay with him. The rest of everybody gets on the boat, goes back to Panama. And Pizarro says, "Send another boat. We want to go on." And there's another period of time before the boat comes. When that second ship comes, Pizarro is able to lead them farther south. The stories of that further voyage are a little bit vague. We don't know exactly how far they go, but we know they got at least to what is today Tumbes, the northernmost city in Peru. It was an Inca town. And there are stories that they go a little bit further, actually probably to the mouth of the Santa River, which is the largest river in northern coastal Peru. And along the way, they captured a couple of Inca people, 4 males. They got some llamas. They actually stopped some boats, some rafts that were off the coast, and took things off of that, among other things, a lot of gold. Enough to have paid for the expedition. So when they get back to Panama in 1527, it is basically a successful deal. They have shown that there is a more established state farther to the south, that it's very, very rich. It's got gold. They've got a couple of people. Those males that they brought back begin to learn Spanish and therefore then become translators. You might also note this is 1527, which is when Huayna Capac has died and when the dispute between Atahualpa and Huáscar begins and the Civil War begins. Tumbes, the town that they saw, was a functioning Inca town in 1527. When they next see it in 1531, it has been destroyed in the Civil War. So, the next year, after getting back to Panama, Pizarro gets on a ship, goes to Spain, talks to Ferdinand and Isabella, shows them the llamas, the things that he has taken back, some of the gold, has at least one of the Inca people with him. And something else to point out, in 1518, 1519, Cortez had conquered the Aztec state, and wealth, gold and stuff has been coming back to Spain for almost 10 years from Mexico. And now Pizarro is telling Ferdinand and Isabella that there's even more riches to the south, so they are quite willing to sponsor an expedition farther south, and they name Pizarro as the governor and captain general of any territories that he's going to be able to conquer. Doing that divides Pizarro and Almagro, because they do not name Almagro as governor and captain general. Pizarro is the guy who's got the title and the authority. In January of 1530, Pizarro gets an expedition going. He goes back to Panama, and this time he brings 3 of his brothers. These are half-brothers. These are legitimate sons of his father, Juan and Hernando and Gonzalo. He also brings a guy who is a son of his mother, so a half-brother from his mother, different father. And we now have essentially 5 brothers or half-brothers as the expedition. They're close. They're his close confidants. They're his assistants on this expedition. In January of 1531, Pizarro leaves Panama and heads south. He goes directly to Tumbes. And he has about 180 men. A few years later, another guy, a few months later, another guy, Hernando de Soto, who some of you may have heard about, comes after them in more ships. And so now we have about 300 Spaniards involved in the expedition. De Soto is here or there. he becomes essentially right-hand man to Pizarro. He's, again, somebody who's had some experience in the New World already, participated in some of the expeditions, and after Peru, I won't talk more about him, about what he does, except to say that later on, he's the guy who explores Florida and ultimately dies along the Mississippi River by some disease or something, and gets real famous when he gets a car named after him. They arrived in 1531. About a year later, they have made it as far as the Sechura Desert, which is the very large desert in northern Peru. And they found the first Spanish town. They've been around Tumbes and moving south gradually. They found the first town of Piura. If you go to Piura today, it's not there. The town of Piura has been flooded out repeatedly in El Niños, and the original location is really not known, but we know that the town was moved at least twice over the years, so where the modern town is, modern city of Piura, is not the original location. But that's the first Spanish town. They proceed on south. It takes them several more months to get to the Lambayeque area where the modern city of Chiclayo is. In one of the lectures coming up, actually my next lecture, we'll see quite a bit of stuff around the Lambayeque area. He's got a force of 160 men. And these are the guys that are called the men of Cajamarca. In the conquest of Peru, if you were a man of Cajamarca, one of the guys who got to Cajamarca, that was a mark of honor, mark of distinction, and they're the guys that ultimately got very wealthy with the conquest. It took them a couple more months to get 2 more valleys to the south, to the Valley of Zania. I talked about that last time with the flooding, El Nino flooding that took place in Zania. They started their way up towards Cajamarca. They had heard that Cajamarca was a major major Inca city, and that Atahualpa was there. The Inca king was there. So they start there. It takes them only a week or so to get from the coast up into the mountains. It's a relatively short distance. Driving today on a nice paved road, it's about an hour-and-a-half drive. They arrive in Cajamarca on November 15th, and the view that they get is this. This is from the spot where they supposedly come into the valley. They look across the town. The town, the main part of the Inca town, was actually right down in here. And across the way, on these hills off in the distance, Atahualpa's army was camped. There's a spot there today that's called the Baños de Inca. It's a hot springs area. And Atahualpa's army had just fought a big battle and defeated Huáscar's army. They were there, camped on the hills around the hot springs, recuperating. This is another shot of Cajamarca. I hadn't been in Cajamarca for a long time, and I was there a year ago. It has expanded tremendously. It's a big modern city. The world's largest gold mine, richest gold mine, is just a few miles outside of town. And in the last decade or so, Cajamarca has really boomed and changed an awful lot. It's no longer the little colonial city that I first saw in 1967. But off in these hills, off in the distance, was the army of Atahualpa. And later the same day, the day they come into the valley, excuse me, Pizarro sends Hernando de Soto and 3 other men on horseback out to the Baños de Inca, the spot where Atahualpa's army was camped, to greet Atahualpa and to invite him to come into the town, meet with Pizarro. Supposedly, according to the story, this is, again, Poma de Ayala's drawing of it, but according to the story, Atahualpa is seated on a throne, and Hernando de Soto rides up and has his horse rear up, and all the Incas are greatly impressed because Atahualpa does not back off, is not scared. He's not impressed by this guy on a horse rearing up in front of him. But he accepts the invitation to come the next day with some of his men into the town of Cajamarca. So the next day, November 16th, one of the most important days in Peruvian history, Atahualpa and some of his men come into the town. Now, I've been very deliberate in saying some of his men, several thousand soldiers accompanied him. But they were not prepared for battle. They were not carrying all their weapons. They were not ready to fight. And Pizarro had taken his 160 men and put them in the buildings around the square. At the corners of the square, he had his cannons, and he had his horsemen up some of the side streets when Atahualpa comes into the square. So this is the square. It is still the same square, although the Inca buildings around it are not there, except for one little building that's located right here. I'll point out in a minute. A little bit closer view. This is the square, and Pizarro's men were either in the buildings, the Inca buildings around the square, or up the side streets with their horses. So Atahualpa comes in on his litter, accompanied by several thousand men, and this is another kind of more fanciful drawing. A priest, Valverde here, goes out to talk with Atahualpa, along with at least one of the interpreters, and the priest shows Atahualpa a Bible. Now, Atahualpa had clearly never seen a book, had never seen anything printed, and the priest Valverde apparently tells Atahualpa that this is the Word of God, and this is very, very sacred, and Atahualpa is a god, a living God on earth, and throws down the Bible. That's the symbol here. Again, Atahualpa in the center, Valverde, the priest, with the Bible, hands it to him, and it's thrown down. Throwing down the Bible is the symbol or the signal for Pizarro's men. They start shooting, the horsemen come in, the cannons go off. Pizarro here grabs a hold of Atahualpa and captures him. Pulls him off of his litter, captures him. The accounts are that this was a slaughter, and it went on for several hours. Probably a couple thousand Incas were killed. The Spanish had swords, they had guns, they had cannons, and the Incas were not basically armed and ready for a fight. So Atahualpa is captured, and lots of Incas are killed. Atahualpa is taken to one of the rooms adjacent to the plaza, and this is Atahualpa with his Spanish guard, and he is held for ransom. The room in which he was supposedly held, or where the ransom was to be paid, still exists. It's a typical Inca building. Very nice stonework with the trapezoidal niches and so forth. And supposedly Atahualpa is put into the room. He raises his hand and he promises that if you free me, I will fill this room twice with silver and once with gold. And the Spanish like that. The word goes out, and gold and silver from throughout the empire begins to arrive in Cajamarca. There is a line, supposedly a red line, that is how high he reached and what was going to be the line to fill it. I sincerely doubt that is the original line, but if you go there today, you can see the line that marks supposedly how high the room was to be filled with gold and silver. Over a period of months, gold and silver are arriving. Atahualpa learns some Spanish. He learns to play chess. He talks and tells stories and so forth to the Spanish. But not quite a year later, the Spanish at Pizarro decide that they need to get rid of Atahualpa, that he is not going to be good to have around, that the Incas would revolt if he continues to exist. So they order his execution. This is Wamampoma's version of the death of Atahualpa. Shows his head being chopped off. Here's another version, him being burned at the stake. In actuality, the best stories, the best estimates are that he was garroted, that he was strangled to death. He had converted to Christianity right at the end, and strangling was supposed to be a much better death than getting your head chopped off or burning at the stake. While Atahualpa was being held, those 10 months or so, the treasure of the empire is coming in, and Pizarro sends out an expedition to explore the empire. It's led by two of his brothers, Juan and Hernando, along with Hernando de Soto, again, a guy that figures very prominently in the Conquest. They continue south on the main Highland Inca Highway, then swing down to the coast and explore somewhat on the coast. They find a very, very big Inca center just to the south of Lima called Pachacamac. Some of you, if you're doing a tour of Lima on the 2 days we're there, you might go down to Pachacamac. Spanish arrived there in early 1532. They get back to Pizarro in 1533 up in Cajamarca, where the men are waiting. They report that the Inca Empire is very, very big and very, very rich. At that point, they decide to go off towards Cusco. After Atahualpa is killed, Pizarro begins to lead an expedition south. They appoint another guy as the new king. Unfortunately, he dies along the way, so then they appoint a third guy as the king, a guy by the name of Manco Cápac. They reach Cusco in November of 1533. Basically, a year after they had captured Atahualpa, they first get to Cusco. So on this map, they had arrived initially at Tumbes in the far north on the Gulf of Guayaquil. They had spent almost a year working their way south. They moved up to the mountains. They check things out. They get all the way down here, go up to Cajamarca. Then the first expedition with Juan and Hernando Pizarro and Hernando de Soto goes south and swings around and gets to Pachacamac and then comes back. And then Pizarro's people follow the main Inca highway in November of 1533 and get all the way down to Cusco. Here's Francisco Pizarro again. They get to Cusco in 1533, and when they arrive, there are Incas, mummies, viewing the arrival of the Spanish into the city of Cusco. Now, I'm going to speed up the story. Atahualpa had a number of relatives. Pizarro takes on one of them as his concubine or consort and has a couple of children by that woman. He has another consort or concubine and has two kids by them. The only one that survives is his daughter, Beatrice, that goes back ultimately to Spain. She marries her uncle, Hernando. And when I showed you the house back in Spain, in Toledo, or excuse me, Trujillo, Spain, that's Hernando Pizarro and Beatrice who end up back there. And Beatrice has the wealth of her father, and Hernando has the wealth that he got as one of the conquerors. So they became a very wealthy family back in Trujillo. Now, Almagro, all this time, has been left behind. He stays back in Piura when Pizarro leads the 160 off to Cajamarca. And the priest that was supposedly with them, or one of their partners, is back in Panama sending reinforcements down and so forth. Pizarro decides that what he will do is he'll have Almagro conquer his own territory. Essentially the southern half of the Inca Empire. Everything south of Cusco has not yet been explored. So about a year and a half after they arrived in Cusco, there's dissension between Pizarro and Almagro, and Pizarro says, you know, you go off and you conquer all that, and you can be the captain general and governor of everything you find south of Cusco. So Almagro leads an army that goes all the way down to what is about today Santiago, Chile. And that's what's called the Atacama Desert. And he doesn't find much in the way of wealth. He has a small group of Spaniards and several thousand Indians with him on this expedition. Many of them die off along the way. Some of them decide to stay and settle in various places that they visit. Ultimately, only about a quarter of Almagro's men, including Almagro, get back to Cusco in 1535, which is an important arrival because in the meantime, while Almagro is off, Pizarro has gone off to the coast and founds the city of Cusco, excuse me, city of Lima. And the Incas in Cusco, under the puppet ruler that the Spanish had imposed on the empire, Manco Capac, the Incas rebel. And they almost succeed in defeating the Spanish in Cusco. It's only the return of Almagro and his people that save Cusco. In the fighting that went on in that new civil war between the Incas and the Spanish in Cusco, one of Pizarro's brothers, Juan Pizarro, is killed at the site of Sacsayhuaman. And those of you who are going to Cusco and Machu Picchu and so forth, you'll probably go up to Sacsayhuaman. That was where some of the fighting took place, and that's where Juan Pizarro is killed. This is Manco Capac. He apparently was chosen by Pizarro as a puppet leader because he was young and inexperienced. It turned out he was a pretty good leader. And when they rebelled, and after the siege of Cusco was lifted, he fled down to what is called the Sacred Valley, the valley of the Urubamba River, to the town of Ollantaytambo. They had a big battle at Ollantaytambo. The Incas actually won that battle. The Spanish had lost many men and had to flee back to Cusco, but Manco realized that he was not going to be able to hold out against the Spanish forces there in the Cusco area. So he fled down the Urubamba Valley off in the direction to the north, the direction of what is today Machu Picchu and further on, and established a Inca state, a rebel Inca state, out there into the jungles. So Juan Pizarro has died. Pizarro himself is down in Lima. There is fighting in Lima. The Incas and some of their allies tried to lay siege to Lima. It's only the arrival of a group of Indians that liked the Spanish, who hated the Incas, that had been oppressed by the Incas over a generation or so, an army of Indians that supported the Spanish that saved Lima. So both Lima and Cusco were saved by the arrival of forces that defeated the Indians. Almagro was still a problem, and Pizarro's people killed Almagro. Almagro's people killed Pizarro. Again, note the date, 1541. Pizarro had been in the New World for probably 40 or 41, maybe even 42 years. I doubt that there was any Spaniard in the New World at that time who had been around longer than Pizarro. He was an old man and an experienced conqueror. He had participated in the exploration of what is today coastal Colombia, Caribbean coastal Colombia, of western Panama and Costa Rica, and obviously conquering Peru. And he essentially died as an old man. One of his brothers, Gonzalo, led a revolt against the Spanish viceroy, and he was killed, put to death. It's only Hernando that went back to Spain and lived out his life as a rich man back in Trujillo, Spain. If you go to Lima today, and again, those who aren't going off to Machu Picchu, you probably do a tour of the Lima area. You may well go downtown to the main Plaza de Armas in central Lima. The government palace is there, the presidential palace. The cathedral is on another side of the square. If you go into the cathedral, turn immediately left as you walk in the front doors, and there's the tomb of Pizarro, at least supposedly the tomb of Pizarro. We're not quite sure if it is. It was a tomb that was discovered, and in the tomb, as it was excavated a few years ago, there was some writing that suggested it was Francisco Pizarro, and so they've created a nice coffin crypt for him. But right inside the door, to the right as you come in the front door. The only one that really survived the conquest was Hernando. He married Beatrice. He had his wealth from the conquest, and she had the wealth of her father, and they lived out their lives in Trujillo. Manco Inca went down into the jungles. The Spanish pursued him. They had several expeditions trying to capture him. Ultimately, he was assassinated by a couple of Spaniards who had taken the wrong side in the civil war that ultimately led to Gonzalo Pizarro's death. Right after the fighting between Almagro's people and Pizarro's people, there were some people that lost in that fighting, and they fled down to the jungle where Manco was, and they said that they were Spanish that didn't like Pizarro, and could we stay with you and so forth. There were several of them. And they stayed for about a year with Manco. They ultimately were accepted and being held, were friendly to the Incas. But then they decided, apparently, that if they killed Manco and went back to Cusco and told them that they had killed Manco and finally defeated the Incas, that they would then be forgiven for being on the wrong side of the Civil War, which is what they did. They killed Manco, and then all the Incas killed them, so they did not get back to Cusco. But one of Manco's sons became the new ruler down there. He lasted for a while, and then he died, and then another son or grandson of Manco, Tupac Amaru, became the new Inca. In, I think, 1472, he was captured. He was taken off to Cusco. He was executed in the main plaza in Cusco, and that ends the conquest of the Peru, of the Incas. Basically, roughly 2 generations after the initial contacts by Pizarro, the Incas were totally conquered, pacified, when the last group was captured and taken off to Cusco. Later on, a couple centuries later, in the late 1700s, a man in southern Peru rebelled against the Spanish. He took on the name of Tupac Amaru II and tried to have a civil war, rebellion against the Spanish. The Spanish ultimately put that down, and it wasn't until another generation before successful revolt against the Spanish, and Peru became independent. Today, in the highlands, they still talk about Manco or Tupac Amaru coming back once again for the revival of the Inca Empire, but it probably will never take place. And that's the conquest of Peru. Any questions?